Well, welcome, Secretary of State, and thank you very much indeed for coming and giving evidence to us. We very much welcome, as you know, your evidence that you give before the committee. I think you know that Lord Boswell is unable to be with us today, and I'm chairing on his behalf. But I know he's very sorry to miss this session. We will, as always, send your staff a verbatim of the session afterwards in order to make any factual corrections that are necessary. We'll aim to finish by about 12:40, 12:45. We may run over if the questions and the answers get particularly interesting. We shall see how that.
I don't know. Is that an incentive for me to be interesting or to keep?
There is always an incentive and a hope that you'll be particularly interesting, Secretary of State, if I can say
of course.
that way. But I think it would be, before we get into a list of questions, I think it would be helpful if you were to bring us up to date with quite a few sort of events which have been happening over the last the last 24 hours or so. We've got the talks clearly going on with the Labour Party. We've got the dispatch of Olly Robbins to Brussels, and we have the announcement last week of the decision to bring the EU withdrawal bill before Parliament early next month. And I mean, the government's sort of given the impression of in the last few weeks of running very, very hard on the spot. But I just wonder whether you now thought it was going to be a kind of purposive move forward.
Well, thank you for that. And I think since we last met, you also had a session with two of the most senior officials within the department.
Extremely helpful.
I hope that was helpful. And I think when we last met Lord Jay, one of the things I was very keen to explore is how do we work differently between the department and the committee. And I hope that sort of session was firstly of value, but secondly shows that when I talked about working differently with the committee, one can then see actually that following through in terms of the discussions and how we interact. You're absolutely right, Lord Jay, in terms of we have, over the last 6 weeks, been having discussions with the official opposition. I think that is a reflection of the fact that Parliament to date has not been able to reach a decision. Various options have been before the House, both the Prime Minister's deal, which has been rejected by the House on 3 occasions, but so have the various other options in terms of indicative votes. And so the Prime Minister has sought to work with the opposition, and those discussions have been going on for 6 weeks. I think what the outcome, in terms of you referenced last night, what I think the outcome of the meeting between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition last night was a recognition that after 6 weeks, both sides have now explored each other's position. I think the facts and the understanding has been fully explored, and I think there now is a sense that those talks need to come to a conclusion. And that is why the Prime Minister set out last night that the House, our House, the House of Commons, will have an opportunity to vote on the withdrawal agreement bill the week commencing the 3rd of June. So the talks are still ongoing. I think they, certainly on the government side, we have viewed them as constructive. I think both sides have engaged seriously on them. I think the public generally has wanted to see the main parties see if an understanding can be reached. I think within the European Union, there was a sense that in Europe, that is, the expectation is that political parties would seek to reach an agreement. And so I think it's helpful also with our European colleagues to explore that. As you well know, Lord Jay, it's not our tradition within our adversarial nature of politics. So I think it is challenging for both sides. But I think it's been the right thing for us to explore. And I think it's also right for the Prime Minister to then say, well, it's been 6 weeks so far, 7 weeks. It's now time that we give Parliament an opportunity to vote on the legislation, which is what the Prime Minister set out.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Do you want to say just something about what Olly Robbins is up to?
Yes, so I think there's, if I look at my opposite number, so Sir Keir Starmer will often say the dispatch box, yes, I note the letter you have secured from President Tusk, President Juncker, but it doesn't change the text of the withdrawal agreement or the political declaration. Yes, I hear, or I can look at the unilateral declaration where the Attorney General set out how that changed in paragraph 17 of his legal advice, the legal risk associated with concerns of bad faith. One of the concerns with the backstop from many members of Parliament was that it would be used as a trap and the EU would exploit it. So the unilateral declaration was aimed at saying, well, if the other side were acting in bad faith, how does one address that from a legal risk perspective? But from the opposition's point of view, there is a concern that the text of the political declaration hasn't changed, and so what is being explored with the EU is whether there is any appetite on their side to do so, if so, to what degree. Because I think on the UK side, sometimes, again, there is a misunderstanding of the government position, whereby, for example, if the political declaration doesn't include language on participation in certain security cooperation, is that because the UK government didn't want to participate, or is it because at that point the EU were unwilling to provide text to that effect? And I think through the talks what we've been able to share is it was the latter, not the former. And I think, again, in light of the discussions and the fact that it's then a cross-party ask, it's worth exploring with the EU, is there any appetite to go further in areas which the UK wanted to go, but at that time the EU were not willing to agree to.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very helpful introduction. I think we'll pick up on a number of those points as we go through the questions. Baroness Noakes.
I'd like to pick up the withdrawal bill coming to Parliament. It's coming in the week commencing the 3rd June. Yes. And you said a moment ago that there would be a vote in that week, which implies there'll be first and second reading in that week.
Yes, so the idea is that second reading will be in that week. Obviously, there's President Trump's visit as well, so that's going to be an interesting week. And I think what that lends also then to the question is around when we publish the bill. I'm acutely aware of the desire, I'm sure, from this committee, but also in the other House, colleagues such as Sir Bill Cash, obviously very keen to see that text. For my part, I'm extremely keen to get that out myself, because I think the sooner we can share that, the better. I think one of the difficulties is, as the talks have been ongoing, it's quite hard to lock down the text, because obviously those discussions are still ongoing. So there is a recognition in government we need to publish that as soon as possible, but I'm not in a position, Baroness Noakes, today to give a date as to when the draft bill will actually be published.
Okay, so but you do accept that it is important that certainly the House of Commons has time to look at the bill before going to a second reading.
I think it is important, and I think there's a desire to do that. I absolutely recognise that. What I would say, however, is there has been no shortage of discussion on the withdrawal agreement. There's been no shortage of discussion on the issues. Indeed, I sent quite a detailed, a 10-page response to John Redwood yesterday regarding some quite detailed concerns that he had raised, which, in the view of the government, were misconceptions around the withdrawal agreement, but the other sort of issues one will get into in the debate on the bill. So actually many of these issues, as that letter shows, have been aired. But I do think there is a legitimate expectation on both houses to actually see the text, and I think government is looking to facilitate that as soon as possible.
Okay. I believe the Cabinet agreed it was imperative that the bill completed all stages prior to the summer recess. That is a very tight timetable for a bill which would only have its second reading in the first week of June, given that it would need to have quite extensive scrutiny, I would have thought, in the other place. And you should not underestimate the appetite for detailed scrutiny that exists in this House. How is the government sure that it can even get those stages through by the We don't have a date for summer recess, but let's say the last week of July.
Well, and always conscious when I appear at these discussions that of the expertise on the committee, including former Chief Whips, who fully understands the issue. But I think, firstly, the houses can move the houses will move at different speeds depending on where the text is, what the level of agreement is between the two parties. So sometimes we saw, for example, I sort of raise his eyebrows with that, but if I pray in aid to that argument when the Cooper Bill, which I didn't agree with, but the Cooper Bill certainly moved at pace, I think it's reasonable to say, through your House as well as the House of Commons. So if you concede that point, the wider point is it can move at different speeds where there's agreement, and part of that, therefore, is to what extent is there agreement between the two main parties. That doesn't negate the fact that, regardless of whether there is agreement there will be many others who wish to scrutinise in detail. And you're absolutely right, Manas notes, in terms of the timescale is challenging. But I think there is a desire in the country, I think there is a desire in the business community for us to move forward to try and address the uncertainty that there is. And I think that will be a consideration that parliamentarians will weigh alongside their scrutiny. I think there has been a lot of consideration of the issues. The withdrawal agreement bill has been out there as a text since last year. So many of these issues have been extensively aired. Of course, in the committee stage and amendments, we will want to get into the detail of that. But from a government point of view, we do feel that we should try and resolve this by summer recess. And that also has shaped, as Lord Joe referenced at the start, the statement from the Prime Minister last night, because there does come a point at which we need to have second reading if we are to be able to deliver the legislation by the summer recess.
And is it clear that this is the last chance saloon for the withdrawal agreement in its current form? That is to say, it's the last chance that the Commons will get to vote on it.
Yeah, I think if the House of Commons does not approve the WAB, then the Barnier deal is dead in that form. And I think the House will have to then address a much more fundamental question between whether it will pursue and communicate on a no deal option or whether it will revoke. And I think what has characterised the discussion on this has been an unwillingness within the House of Commons to make a final decision between whether it is a deal, a no deal, or a revoke. Those are the three options. The Prime Minister has said it many times. The House, of course, has given a view on the deal in terms of voting on the Prime Minister's deal 3 times. That is why we've sought to explore in a Parliament where the government doesn't have a clear majority with the opposition. I think if you look at the detail, and I think we had this discussion last time, the actual text of the withdrawal agreement, from an opposition point of view, there's often a question as to what is it that they, is it the legal obligations? No. Is it the citizens' rights? No. Is it safeguarding the no hard border in Northern Ireland? No. But that didn't stop a vote against the withdrawal agreement, notwithstanding that. Part of that was the lack of clarity on the political declaration, which it relates to the attempts to seek some further detail on that. But ultimately, if the House is not willing to back a deal, then I do think we need to then confront the decision. Is it no deal or revoke? And accept the consequences of that.
Okay. Do the government now accept that there is the MEPs who will be elected at the European elections next week will need to take their seats in early July?
I think the answer to that will be yes, because I think, again, from a government point of view, we were very keen to try and secure the passage of the legislation prior to the European elections. And I think that was the crux of the issue around the third vote, the vote where it was purely on the meaningful vote, because we had a legal right then to extend up to May, as opposed to the 12th of April, which is where, because the withdrawal agreement vote didn't go through, the extension sat. It was because there was that right confirmed that the Speaker, as I understand it, was willing to grant that further vote. I think it's a source of regret that we didn't take that opportunity as a House of Commons to move forward and deliver. The consequence of that is, as a matter of law, as a member of the EU, which we will be at that point, then the elections are required. And that's not just an issue in terms of the United Kingdom. That is also, I think the point sometimes, Lord Jay, that is missed, is the fact it also affects the voting rights of UK citizens in EU countries. And I think from an EU perspective, there would be questions around the legal certainty of the Commission if there were questions over the composition of the European Parliament and that vote. So it was in that context that the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster therefore made the written ministerial statement that he did. It's on that basis that the elections are taking place, and that's a source of huge regret, but it is a legal requirement.
Fine. Okay, thank you. Just one final question from me, which is a legislative loose end. The trade bill left our House with some amendments which were not to the government's liking.
Yes.
Could you give us any idea when that will be returned to the Commons for consideration of those amendments?
Well, that will be a question for the Leader of the House through the business statement process, and I would not want to preempt that before the House being shared with the House through the usual way.
Just following on from the question from Lady Noakes about the MEPs who will be elected next week, would it be your understanding that they would have a right to vote and get actively involved with the decisions on future President of the Commission and so on?
Well, I think it's, again I defer to what is the legal position on this. So the legal position is the United Kingdom is a member, and therefore members of Parliament will have the rights that affix in that status until that changes. Now, I think that the strong desire, certainly on the government's part, is that we leave the EU at the earliest opportunity, and so that we, and this comes back to Baroness Noakes' points in terms of timing, that we deliver the legislation as soon as we can, so that is for as short a period as possible. And I think also, to be fair, that is also the desire when I speak to EU leaders, because they have, and Lord Jay will know this, I'm sure, through his own contacts, they have a degree of Brexit fatigue. They want to move on. When I was in Sibiu last week, they have a forward agenda of issues that they want to address. For them, it's not all about Brexit, certainly not. And so I think there is a desire on both sides to move forward. But the legal position is, if the UK is a member, then members of Parliament will have the rights as any other member of Parliament.
Lord Little.
Just following up on that, one of the things the government did do, to its credit, as I understand it, is make a commitment at the European Council that, as far as the Council is concerned, it wouldn't try and disrupt business while we were in this very odd situation of wanting to leave but not able to secure a majority to leave, and that was one of the factors that persuaded the European Council to grant us an extension. And that would be a factor at the end of October as well. But the problem with the European Parliament is that if a lot of members are returned, I'm sure we could speculate about who they might be, that there might not be this spirit of goodwill towards behaving responsibly. So have you any comment to make on that situation?
Well, not surprisingly, you very astutely pick up on why I referred to the legal position as opposed to what the political outcome would be, because you're absolutely right that there is a distinction. So firstly, the legal position of what members of the European Parliament can and can't do is different from what they may choose to do. So the point is, legally they're there. Now, you're absolutely right. There are certain political parties standing who probably would say that their purpose is to disrupt and take a particular line. But I think there are also mainstream parties. I noticed, for example, Guy Verhofstadt was over campaigning with the Lib Dem party in terms of Timmermans and so the various senior roles within the EU. There may be people looking in terms of the S&D numbers and what that might mean in terms of top jobs. So I think different parties will approach it in different ways. I think what you also referred to, though, is what will the government's approach be? And I think that's, I think what has characterised the approach the Prime Minister has taken is, as you correctly reflect, has been an approach of sincere cooperation. I think that has been the approach that Her Majesty's government has taken throughout the Article 50 process. And I think there will be a continual constructive approach. Now, as to, in terms of what role the Prime Minister would take in discussions, that is obviously a matter for the Prime Minister and not for me. But I think what one can see is throughout the Article 50 process, there has been an approach of sincere cooperation, and I would expect that to continue.
Lord Whitty, I think, is the question, then the Earl of Canute.
Yes, I know you referred to the Leader of the Commons in answer to Baroness Note, but it's not only the trade bill which is in abeyance. I mean, we were told that we had at least 8 bills that needed to go through before Brexit Day, when Brexit Day was the 29th of March. Agriculture, environment, fisheries, migration. Do I understand that even with an October Brexit date, the government have accepted that none of those, or very few of those, will get through in the timetable?
I think so. I think it's in the public domain and has been reported. So I think the Cabinet will be looking at how we prepare. So in terms of legislation for no deal, we will be discussing that again very shortly. I think what is clear is that government made a huge amount of progress, particularly on areas such as statutory instruments. I think 520 went through as part of that, so a huge amount of work was undertaken on SIs. In terms of how we use the additional time we have to prepare in the event of a no-deal outcome, for example, if the EU if a extension is neither requested or granted, and there's various scenarios one can play through around that. And then we will look at that legislation, and obviously the business managers, that is an issue that the business managers will consider as part of those discussions.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. And, Secretary State, I wonder if we can go back to the cross-party talks as a crossbencher. I suppose I'm allowed to ask this question, or a series of questions. The cross-party talks between the Labour Party and the government. And I wonder if you could begin by giving us a bit more colour about what exactly is the areas of discussion are.
I think the starting point would be the 6 tests that the Leader of the Opposition has set out and what they were looking for. And I think what the government has set out in terms of checkers and in terms of its position. So the various areas I think one can look at. So first the debate on customs arrangement, benefits of customs union, and where one lands on that debate. There's a debate that my opposite number was exploring in the Guardian over the weekend in terms of the second referendum and the position of a body of members of Parliament within his party and where the opposition are on that. There's the issue in terms of workers' rights. So as you will know, the agreement already has a non-regression commitment, but the trade unions, for example, have sought a firmer commitment than that. There's a question around the phase 2 and the negotiating obligations, what sometimes is called in the Commons around the Snell-Nandy amendment, and John Mann has also tabled things in the past there. John more on the workers' rights, but also on the negotiating obligations and how we consult with the House and report back to the House. There's the issue I referred to earlier in terms of Lord Jay's question around security and agencies and what our participation might be there. And then there's a question around alignment So single market alignment, where the government set out its position in terms of the Northern Ireland border and goods, and understanding there. So I think within the discussions, part of it has been explaining the respective positions, seeing where the positions are perhaps closer than some of the political knockabout sometimes suggests, and other areas where the differences between the parties are more fundamental.
Well, that's very helpful, and thank you. Yesterday, the Cabinet was discussing areas of compromise, and that's both compromises where you would give and what you were seeking in terms of compromises that the Labour Party would give. I wonder if you could give us some colour on those two areas, please.
Sure. Well, I think, firstly, compromise works both ways. So I think it's not just simply about where the government compromises. There has to be compromise on both sides. I think there are areas, for example, and I context with the fact that the talks are ongoing, and I think it's reasonable to, Lord Jay, protect the confidentiality of those. So I don't want to stray too much into detail, but at the same time, I recognise we've got a number of very senior stakeholders here, so I want to lean in
just a little bit
as much as I can. So there's a balance to be struck. So for example, I think on workers' rights, what sort of economy are we seeking to build in a post-Brexit world? Is that as sometimes gets characterised as a sort of race to the bottom, deregulatory approach? The Prime Minister has always been clear, no, that isn't the case. We're not seeking to do that. Actually, what we're looking to do through the industrial strategy, through apprenticeships, through a skills-based immigration system, actually develop a more skills-based quality, build on our universities, innovation to market, quality marketplace. How do we therefore provide reassurance on workers' rights as to what the government's intentions are, given the concerns on the Labour side, for example, whether a future change of leader would take a different approach and what reassurance might be given. So those are the sort of areas where I think actually sometimes there is some common ground, but there's also an issue of trust and what reassurance can be given. So those are sort of areas. Likewise, on the confirmatory vote, which others will have a better idea of the numbers within the Labour Party than I do on that, but I think in The Guardian, Sakir was reported as 120, 150, whether others may say it's fewer than that, but people will have a different view on numbers. But of that, if the Prime, given the, and it was referenced at our previous session, given where the Kyle Wilson amendment was, then there's a question, would you need to have talks if you added a confirmatory vote, given that? And therefore, if you're going to do lots of things, or if you're going to have a discussion with the other parties, from a government point of view, why would you do that if you were doing a confirmatory vote? And the government is set, is very clear in its concern with the idea of a confirmatory vote. So those are the sort of areas where what is an area where perhaps the parties can be more aligned, and what are the areas where the difference is much more fundamental.
Well, I'm very grateful for that actually very helpful response. A couple of words were missing from your analysis, and they are customs and union. And I wondered whether there was a possibility of compromise there. And one of the ideas, of course, is a sort of temporary membership of the customs union with a clear exit agreement. But how does that feature on the radar screen?
Yeah. Well, in my defence, I think I did say the benefits of a customs union. So they weren't entirely missing. And I think one looks at the government's approach, it has been to say, how do we combine the benefits with an independent trade policy? I think the concern from the opposition side has been primarily, is that deliverable? Because it is a different approach. And if not, what is the fallback position? And to what extent do options enable them to pursue their policy in the future? Their policy being, as you well know, to have a say on EU trade agreements, which from a government point of view we question the deliverability of, given the EU treaty expressly prohibits that. So that's the sort of crux of the sort of areas of discussion, and to what extent does the government approach preclude a future Labour government from pursuing its policy, given that neither party can bind the other post a general election, given that that's a constitutional principle which I think both sides accept. So that's absolutely the sort of discussion that we have explored, and I think goes to the crux of the issue.
Thank you again for that. I suppose something that's of great interest to this committee is the future of Parliament's role in the future relationship trade talks and also things like environmental and social protections. And I wondered how that had come up in the discussions and what progress had been made.
Yeah. So I think that there's, if I perhaps take them in reverse order, so on the environmental side, I think, again, that is, if one looks at the various comments that Michael Gove has set out in terms of the government's commitment to environmental standards, then again, that is something where the government actually wants to take a leadership role. The question there is it's a slightly different argument to the dynamic alignment on workers' rights argument, where the volume of legislation out of Europe on workers' rights is different to that on the environment, a much higher volume on the environment, and so there's issues in terms of how those would be dealt with. But the government's own position is we want to have high environmental standards, and that again is part of the talks between Michael and the Labour front bench. On the issue of Parliament's say, I think there's several things sort of cut up in that. I think firstly there is the fact that the numbers of Parliament will not change, set against if there is a new leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister, then obviously from a Labour point of view, how will that impact on the Phase 2 negotiations? So the numbers will not change, but to what extent are there concerns around the commitments that come out of the talks? I think we have already said that we're very keen, and I think in our previous evidence session, personally I'm very keen that we learn lessons from the first phase. So there will be things that will have been done well. I wasn't imposed, but there'll be things that will have been done well previously, but there'll be other things we can learn from in terms of our engagement with Parliament, and how do we have, in my view, a more transparent, more trusting relationship, more open relationship with Parliament in the Phase 2, and socialise issues upstream. And I think that's hence Director Generals from the Department coming in and having sessions with the committee are part of that shift, which we're not waiting for Phase 2, we're already seeking to engage on that.
Well, thank you for that as well. And in closing, I suppose everyone knows that these talks are very complicated. They've gone on for 6 weeks so far. What can you tell us about how much longer they might go on? Is the arrival of the withdrawal agreement bill a time where they would have to stop, or could they continue notwithstanding? And will they remain talks that are just between yourselves as the government and the Labour Party, or might it be expanded to other parties as well?
Well, I think the first point is, in terms of the talks, as I say, they've gone on now to 6 weeks. They are ongoing, but I think that both sides now have a very good understanding of each other's position. So I think there comes a point at which decisions then need to be made, and I think we are very much at that point. I think when one looks at the scope of the withdrawal agreement bill, then as the Bill Minister, I'm sure I will be having discussions on a clause-by-clause basis with a variety of stakeholders, because that will be a bill subject to significant amendments. Baroness Noakes alluded to this in her questioning, and the government will need to engage widely and consider a multitude of issues, often against quite short timescales, which will be one of the challenges in terms of bill management with that legislation. So there will be engagement, and that will be separate to formal talks with other parties, partly because I think probably two issues. Firstly, just on a numbers basis, the official opposition obviously is in a different position to other parties. But secondly, in terms of the minority parties, with the exception of our confidence and supply partners, but in respect to the other minority parties, they are all very much of the view that they want a confirmatory vote. So that is actually quite hardwired into their position and obviously, again, that shapes those discussions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lord Little, then Lord Tevis, I think, got questions to ask, then Lady Armstrong.
I've always been a bit of a sceptic about these cross-party talks, but the question is this really, is the relationship between what you're discussing with my good friend Sir Keir Starmer and what is likely to be acceptable to Brussels and Mr. Olly Robbins' visit to Brussels. It seems to me that the minimum that the Labour Party is bound to want is changes in the political declaration, because that would give us some guarantee that a new Conservative leader wouldn't just chuck the whole thing out, as it were. So do you accept that if there is going to be an agreement, it would have to result in changes in the political declaration to which the government would have to subscribe and Parliament would have to subscribe? Yeah. That's the first point. The second point is that if you look at the two areas of the customs arrangement, customs union question, isn't what the government is proposing essentially going back to the proposition that was in the Chequers white paper, whereby Britain could set its own tariffs, but at the same time be members, enjoy the benefits of the customs union? Yeah. Don't you think isn't it in practice going back to that? And what chances of that actually being put in the political declaration? First point. Second point, and this is more sort of critical of the Labour stance, as it were, is that at the PLP on Monday, Jeremy Corbyn said we want access to the single market. That involves a lot of regulatory alignment, but it also, from a Brussels perspective, it involves guarantees that Britain won't cheat on things like state aid and competition policy. And do you think do you think that we can achieve access without giving those we can achieve, it's not just a question of regulatory alignment, it's also a question of giving guarantees on these no cheating questions?
Yeah, well, I think there's three distinct issues really. One on the question of alignment, and I think what drives that is the interplay with almost frictionless debate. The second, which is around the government's position, Chequers and independent trade, and how that sits with the Labour position. And third, in terms of what Labour need on political declarations, so perhaps just to unpick, because the three quite distinct issues that you raise. I think firstly on alignment, single market alignment, I think it is worth just reiterating, which I'm sure many around the committee are fully aware, but it is not sometimes the political debate in the House of Commons assumes that if you opt in through a bit more alignment, with that you get more, you reduce the friction accordingly, as if it's a sort of a sloping scale. I mean, it is a point of fact that as of today we don't have completely frictionless. There are certain things on the defence side, for example. So it's not that it's frictionless. The question is how much friction, and you will not get the level of frictionless trade as we have today without fully signing up to the single market, including the four freedoms and including things like VAT alignment. So again, I think sometimes there's this slight misconception, which is, well, if I add a bit on the services side, I will get the corresponding sort of reduction in friction that goes with that additional alignment, and that is not actually the case. And I think it's just worth reinforcing that point, because sometimes people think, well, if I add on another bit and I add another bit, I get a commensurate reduction in friction, and that is not the case. And so the government's position has been, in terms of the Northern Ireland context, around agri and goods, and how much further. The question then is how much further you go. I think in terms of the extent to which Chequers the position is reflected in the political declaration, well, it is, because the political declaration expressly enables an independent trade policy. I mean, that is in the text. I think the question is more on, it's not for me to set out the Labour position, but I suspect the Labour question is more about its deliverability. You know, do they feel that the government can deliver that in the phase 2 negotiations, rather than does the political text, political declaration enable that? And I think in terms of the discussion, Lord Liddell, with the Labour Party and with Sir Keir and others, it is to what extent that prohibits or prevents Labour, should they win the next general election, from pursuing their approach, which is, as I said earlier, to have a say on EU trade, which we don't think is possible under the legal position as a third country. But my view would be the government pursuing its objective does not prevent a future Labour government from then pursuing its objectives. So to what extent is there concern? Because sometimes one hears a conflicting argument from some on the opposition benches, where on the one hand they say that the government ask is undeliverable, and then on the other hand they say actually we're fearful that you will deliver it, and in doing so preclude us from pursuing our option. And I think sometimes there is a conflicting narrative between those two things. In terms of to what extent do Labour require changes to the political declaration? Well, again, firstly, that's not solely within the government's gift, because it will be for the EU. Secondly, you're absolutely right, Lord Liddell, that I think it's fair to say that Sir Keir at the dispatch box has quite often in the debate on the first of the 3 meaningful votes, you know, I've been sat opposite him where he said neither of the texts have changed. The withdrawal agreement text hasn't changed, the political declaration has changed. So is there a desire on the opposition benches to see a change of text? Well, I think if one looks at those debates, it's reasonable to assume the answer to that is yes. The withdrawal agreement text cannot be changed, because I think the EU27 have been unequivocal in repeatedly making clear that the withdrawal agreement text cannot be changed, not least for colleagues on my own side who are very keen to see the protocol in Northern Ireland changed, and the EU has been explicit in saying that, and it would be a slightly contradictory argument to say it can't change and then suddenly to suggest it can. And if one looks at the extension of the text that was granted at the last EU Council, then that is explicit in saying that that is locked down. And I think in terms of then what Labour need, well, you know, that is a question for the leader of the opposition and the Labour negotiating team. But I think what we have been seeking to do through the talks is to explain why the government landed in the position it did on certain issues, whether that's agency, security, workers' rights and so forth. What is it within the control domestically through domestic legislation, and in terms of the political declaration, therefore, are there areas that the EU is willing to move on that in areas that the UK government wanted to in the first place? And those are issues that we've been exploring.
Thank you. Lord Teverson and Baroness Kennedy, then I think we'll have to move on.
I should be brief, Lord Chairman. And Secretary, can I apologise for being late? I've been chairing my own select committee, which only just finished. But I want to come back to this matter of trust and understanding. I have a serious difficulty with this, in that at the end of the day, it has to be more than trust, because trust doesn't work enough in terms of an agreement, I don't think, between political parties or within Parliament. And given the fact that as you say, the withdrawal agreement itself can't be changed, that's not in the gift of anybody at the moment except the EU, which it won't. And this is all around either internal policy or around the political agreement. I just don't understand, with our customary constitution, how anything can be guaranteed for the future, and how, therefore, this can actually work, a conclusion can actually work, because I don't think there is not normally trust within our political system between parties. And I just don't see how anything can be nailed down to get around that problem. So is there actually... So, I mean, I'm suggesting these talks are perhaps useless, because at the end of the day, I mean, I think they're good. Sorry, don't misunderstand me. I think it's very good that they've happened. They should have happened far, far earlier, is my own view. But I just don't see how they can come to a successful conclusion, because there's no way of nailing that agreement down for the future. You can't make it future-proof. Please prove me wrong. I'd be delighted if you could.
Okay. Well, firstly, if I may gently take issue with, on the one hand, your characterisation that the talks are useless but should have happened earlier, because if they are useless, then it would have been pointless if they had happened earlier. In terms of, I mean, the underlying sort of crux of your point, I think we touched on it earlier. I think it is a constitutional point that is accepted, that a government cannot bind the future government. And indeed, that cuts both ways, because the opposition on the one hand can't say we want to entrench things in a way that binds this government beyond the next general election, but doesn't bind the opposition, should it become the government at the next election, from pursuing its option. So there has to be a degree of consistency there. I think the biggest issue, I would argue, in terms of trust, goes to the perhaps oversighted but LBJ point around numbers. You know, so the point of trust is that the current Parliament, as constituted, with the numbers that it has, will only do certain things, because those are the numbers. So regardless of what happens in one party or the other, the numbers of this Parliament will not change. And so therefore, the question is, what can be safeguarded from a trust point of view in this Parliament? And both parties want to preserve their position in terms of post the general election. But I don't think anyone has ever suggested to me, certainly no one has suggested to me on the Labour side, that they want to constrain their own ability post the general election to pursue a different course. So I think the approach has been what can be agreed for this Parliament. Of course, as you well know, Lord Tevers, both parties stood on the manifesto commitment to deliver on the referendum result. So it comes down to a fundamental question: are both parties still trying to deliver on their manifesto? What are the numbers of this Parliament and what it's doing, and what is it that safeguards people's positions post the next general election? And I think if people don't trust in what ministers have to say, then perhaps they will trust in the numbers and the composition of the Commons as it currently is.
Kennedy.
Secretary, I too want to apologise for being late. The world goes on, you know, beyond Brexit, and I was launching a report on sexual harassment and bullying. So there are other things that people out there are trying to address. I just wanted to pick you up on a number of things. Indeed, I want to pick up my dear friend and colleague. The word cheating was referred to as a possibility of how Labour policy might be seen into the future by wanting to have close alignment on the single market. And let me assure you that wanting perhaps an opt-out on state aid and competition might be a perfectly valid thing and was done in the past by Mrs Thatcher, so we shouldn't think of it as cheating. But I want to just raise this business.
How the Brussels thing.
Yes. Well,
I don't think that was my word.
it was on Diddles. And so I'm just...
Brussels thinks of
yeah, I'm rather anxious that we don't let the words take root in our thinking. Anyway, I wanted to ask you, Secretary of State, about something you've just said, which is that more access to the single market, the Labour negotiating piece is to say there should be greater access to the single market. And you were saying that actually greater access does not necessarily mean you get less friction. And I wanted us to unpick that a bit, because in most circumstances, you know, when you're negotiating in any kind of contract, and I say this as a lawyer, there are pluses and minuses, but there would surely be a reduction in friction if you manage to get something around, for example, financial services, that meant that we were not going to have the handicaps that we will have by leaving.
So what I was driving at, I think the precise words that I said was it is not a sort of a line where with each step of additional alignment you get a corresponding reduction in friction. To the point that you can then have the same position as now. The point is, if you want to have the same position as now, in terms of, then you have to sign up to all the aspects, and that includes, as I was referring to, things, you know, the 4 freedoms. It includes VAT, etc. So the point I was saying is, it's often presented as each extra chapter gives an automatic reduction in frictionless, and I think that is a mischaracterisation as a way, and that's what I was referring to.
Lady Armstrong.
Going back to my old trade, the Prime Minister promised in mid-April that options will be put to the Commons so that the Commons could come to a decision, really, she was saying. Now, I assume that's been overtaken by the decision to bring forward the bill, because in a bill you can't take different ways of voting. You can't have an indicative vote that is pushed to a preferential voting system. So how is the government going to fulfil its commitment to put different options to those that are in the current agreements?
So you're absolutely right in that what the Prime Minister set out was, in essence, a Plan A and a Plan B. The Plan A was to explore with the Leader of the Opposition whether an agreement could be reached between the two main parties, and failing that, and I'd have to go back and check the precise language, but in essence it was to say that we would agree to explore with the opposition whether there could be a mutual commitment to be bound by indicative votes, but in essence they would be binding votes. And I think the point there being, again, to explore with the opposition whether there's a willingness to be bound, because there is little point having indicative votes if people are not willing to be bound by the consequence of that, because, as you well know, whatever is then agreed has to go through committee, it has to go through third reading, and therefore if people turn around and say, well, that's my third choice, I'm not going to vote for that at third reading, then it is not going to be effective. So, and I think the opposition have said today that they're not willing to be bound by that process, and therefore the question that would arise, as you know far better than I do, which is where does the sustainable majority come in the House if members of Parliament are not willing to be bound by the result of that. So we're still on Plan A, which is why the talks are still ongoing, but in terms of Plan B, part of that would also be a question for the opposition in terms of whether they would be willing to commit to that.
So you're not proposing any new ways of working other than, or any new propositions you're going to put forward? You'll be waiting for for other members to put forward their proposals in committee?
Well, I think firstly, if one goes back to what the Prime Minister said, it was to explore with the opposition under Plan A, and failing that with Plan B, whether the opposition would be willing to commit to a different process, and to date the opposition are not willing to commit to that process, but the Plan A is still being explored. So that's the position, which is entirely consistent with what the Prime Minister set out. I think if you're saying to what extent is there scope for Hilary Benn or Yvette Cooper or others to table, well, through committee stage, amendments will be tabled in the normal way, and the House will debate those as it ever has. So those issues, I'm sure, will be explored. I don't think there'll be any shortage of amendments during the passage of the bill, and the House will consider those subject to which amendments the Speaker chooses.
Okay.
Baroness Faulkner.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Let's move on to the transition. And we saw that as we approached the deadline of April the 12th, first 29 March and April the 12th, the Commission itself did quite a lot of work around rolling over agreements, memorandums of understanding and so on, to ensure continuity to some extent, to the best extent possible. But many of those rollovers and extensions really only took us to the end of the year. Some of them went forward for a whole year. But when the transition agreement was envisaged, it was going to take us till the end of 2020. So, and I also recall that the Chancellor, in a famous speech, also had described transition as a wasting asset, because unless you got down to it, people would have to make decisions if uncertainty continued. Do you believe now that not making up our minds about what we want to do from the UK side is eating into that transition time period that we had envisaged, and in light of the fact that we are eating into it, do you really believe that we can agree, let's assume on a really good day that things get through the House of Commons, do you really believe that we can do the future relationship negotiations
before the end of the transition period, or are we going to seek an extension beyond 2020 of the transition period?
So you're absolutely right, Baroness Faulkner, in that the longer the House takes to ratify, the more that eats in to the time we then have for the Phase 2 negotiations. As you also referred to, there is scope to extend those. Now, that isn't a unilateral right, that is to be agreed with the EU, so one should be mindful of that. Sometimes, again, this kind of the UK-centric approach, so some of this debate just assumes, as with Article 50 and the extension debate, that this is purely a UK thing, and one should not lose sight that the extension of the implementation period is actually a joint decision. But you are right, it eats into that, and I think that again is why, and it comes back actually to where we started in this session, it's why after 6 weeks of talks one does get to a point where we need to say, look, we need to bring this to a resolution, and amongst the myriad of reasons for that, the impact on the implementation period is one of those.
So are you seeking to extend the transition period had you passed the withdrawal agreement before the 29th of March 2019? Transition would have gone till December 2020. If the withdrawal agreement is not passed, or if there isn't agreement from the UK side to exiting till the 31st of October, will you then be seeking to extend the transition period beyond December 2020?
Well, if we...
Because there will still be an enormous amount to be done in terms.
Well, I think there's two issues within that, if I may. I think the first is if we don't pass the withdrawal agreement, then the Phase 2 falls away, and we are into a much more fundamental question between a no deal or a revoke. There's a question around extension, but I mean, the second referendum debate really is a proxy for revoke, because all you do with a second referendum is add 12 months of further uncertainty and end up with a point which is to either revoke or to leave without a deal, in essence. So to me, people arguing for a second referendum in essence are just dodging, because they don't want to actually confront that their position is to revoke, and that collides with their manifesto. So there's kind of a...
You will know that that's not my position.
Indeed I do. So the Phase 2 falls away if we don't ratify. It becomes a mute issue. I think the crux of what you're driving at is absolutely valid, which is the longer we take to ratify, the shorter the implementation period, and the greater the pressure, therefore, on concluding the Phase 2 within the timescale that is there. But obviously our intention is, objective is to work to that timescale, but there will need to be a decision point for Parliament as to whether it seeks an extension, and that will be shaped by the negotiations that flow.
So it is entirely feasible that Parliament may choose to extend the transition period, because we have not prepared to the extent that we needed to prepare in terms of our future relationship.
Well, it's a future decision which will be shaped by the negotiations. It's not, firstly, so it is a right that we have. It's not a requirement.
Right.
So it's a right that the UK has, but it's not a unilateral right, and it will be shaped by the various events that happen in the interim.
That's right. Wearing a little bit of your hat from your previous life. By the way, I should say that in terms of Baroness Kennedy's question on financial services, our committee heard again and again in Brussels that one part of the single market, of an exception to the single market, they would certainly not do would be financial services. So I'd have to agree with you there. But as you also know, the subcommittee is responsible for the budget and our budget contributions into the EU. Now, we understand from the Economic Secretary of the Treasury, in letters she's written to this committee, that there is that our 2019 contributions are still up there, and we know that the MFF is going to be concluded in her expectations by next year. For initially, first solid discussions by March 2020, and then no later than a little bit later than, let's say, mid-year 2020. If that is the case, and if we have an extension of the transition period, presumably we will first have to agree the budget contributions into 2020, 2019 and 2020, and then presumably if transition is delayed, we will continue to pay into the EU budget. This is just a membership fee, it's not the exit bill. We will continue to pay into the EU budget till whatever period it is, till the end of transition. If I'm right in that regard, then to what extent are we going to be actively arguing our position in the multi-annual financial framework, which will commence, assuming we're paying, given that the Commission has quite ambitious plans for the multi-annual financial framework? Will we expect to hang on to our rebate? Will we be able to exercise our veto? There's a question mark over that in terms of sincere cooperation and our ability to affect what happens unless we revoke Article 50. Can you shed some light on the government's thinking in terms of those obligations, which the Prime Minister consistently says we will honour? But the honouring of those obligations comes with having to take some choices about using a veto, not using a veto, rebate and various other things.
Well, you raise a very interesting area, and I think it goes to the heart of why the December 2020 date was chosen. The 2014-2020 period of the MFF, which David Cameron had negotiated, is that slug of time. You're right that within the 35 to 39 billion estimate, and it is an estimate because it's based on a set of negotiating principles through which these figures will finally be calculated. But in terms of any extension, we're not extending. Our objective is to negotiate for the December 2020 to avoid this. This is partly why we're seeking to ratify the withdrawal agreement as quickly as possible. And if we're not able to do that, I think we will be on a very different trajectory, which is the one that I referred to and people don't want to confront, which is that the House of Commons will face a very clear choice between a no deal or a revoke outcome. And I think it's because the longer the delay, the more issues that arise, that we need to actually crystallise that sort of decision.
Lady Armstrong.
Northern Ireland remain part of the withdrawal agreement. Yep. Has the government got any update for us on how that is going? David Lidington did tell the House at the end of April that the government was investing 20 million in alternative proposals, but it was said at another stage that we were at least 10 years from actual further proposals. This remains a major issue. Where are we on?
Okay, well, I think there's a number of issues that arise from consideration of that. Firstly, I think a very important consideration is whether whether the talks between the parties in Northern Ireland in terms of Stormont deliver a successful outcome or not. Obviously, those are extremely sensitive talks, but extremely important, and that shapes much of the discussion there. On the specific issue in terms of alternative arrangements, Barnier Armstrong, you're right, the government has a commitment to invest £20 million. We are proceeding with 3 working groups, one in terms of parliamentary engagement, one which will be a technical group, and one which will be a business group. They will all be chaired by ministers, and we are moving forward with that. I think the issue there is there's a number of issues that flow from the alternative arrangements works, which is to what extent is there existing technology that is deployable? To what extent is the technology that is deployable, but the unique circumstances of the border in Northern Ireland therefore make that difficult? So you could say that there's GPS tracking technology that could assist, but there may be security issues or community tensions around that. So one's got to look at the technology, one's got to look at the community engagement, one's got to look at the compliance costs, one's got to look at the segmentation, not just on sectors, but also between, say, small traders, multinationals, between trusted trader schemes and so forth. one's got to look at to what extent issues are around the Good Friday Agreement and to what extent it's really about the single market and protecting that. What is the real driver of the debate? So there's a range of issues. You've then got the timescale around that. To what extent is it linked into the political debate on the protocol in Northern Ireland, and to what extent is it linked into, as Baroness Faulkner was correctly alluding to, the date December 2020. So I think within the alternative arrangements there's a whole range of different issues, but we've made clear our commitment to exploring that at pace, and we've committed money to do so. And then one final point on that is that the EU themselves have accepted that there is merit in alternative arrangements, in that they have also made a commitment to joint working on alternative arrangements, but the key there is that is post-ratification. So the government side we will start, have started, and there's work already underway on that. But in terms of the joint working with the EU, that is a post-ratification issue.
And the devolved administrations, how are we getting on with them on everything?
Well, again, I mean, it comes back to working differently with Parliament. I was in the Scottish Parliament last week, exactly because I'm a great believer in showing up. So if we're going to work differently, actually, it's important to go and visit and engage. And demonstrate that rather than simply stand in Westminster and say we're working differently. And I think, again, there are areas of common interest for all the difficulties, perhaps politically, sometimes in the debate. Let me give you one example. I think on citizens' rights, there's a shared desire between the Scottish Government and the UK Government in terms of how we protect citizens' rights. One specific change, and it's similar to the committee, which is I've discussed with Mike Russell how officials from the Scottish Government and the UK Government work much more closely together, because I think that's an area where trust is perhaps easier to establish than sometimes it is at a political level. I think we need to move away from just sort of regular drumbeat of JMC meetings, which have an element of quantity rather than quality. So how do we actually get a slightly different discussion there? I think I alluded to this last time. I think one's also got to be mindful that there are tensions between the point at which one shares with Parliament and one shares with devolved administrations, because if we're sharing it with one before the other, then colleagues in the House of Commons, for example, Sir Bill Cash, would expect his committee to be made aware, this committee would expect to be aware in a timely fashion, and so we need to just balance that. But I think we look at the way my opposite number in terms of Michel Barnier approached the engagement with the 27 and look at how that was handled, and I think there's things that we can apply with the devolved administrations as well.
Just going back to Baron Thompson's first question, can you say what participation there is by the Republic of Ireland in these various working groups you're talking about? Borders have got two sides.
Well, probably the two main routes in there within Her Majesty's Government are firstly through the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who, as you would expect, has very regular engagement with senior ministers in the Republic of Ireland. The second, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, has considerable engagement with Simon Coveney and others there. The Prime Minister, as you know, Lord Jay, also has significant engagement with the Taoiseach head of state level, head of government level, and so there's quite an extensive.
But are they involved in actual working groups, or are those just purely sort of UK side?
The working groups are UK, because from as I referred in my earlier answer, the engagement with the Commission has been as an agreement post-ratification. So it hasn't been done on a bilateral basis. But there will be a desire to engage with them, and part of the discussion as we get into the meat of that work will be that, I think, will be one of the questions we're very keen to surface, and to see what appetite there is from the Irish government in terms of their relationship with the Commission, and what can be done and what they're not willing to do.
Thank you. Lord Whitty.
I just want to focus a bit on the other possible outcome, namely that we don't reach agreement by the 31st of October. Two sorts of questions arise. I appreciate you can't discuss leaked reports, but there has been some reports that you in particular and others were advocating intensifying no-deal preparations. And my subcommittee have been looking at transport, and some of that does need some further reinforcement if there is a real possibility of no deal. Do you think you have the priority and the resources for the contingency of no deal? That's my first question. My second question is the political one, really. What happens if we are in no deal territory to the content of the withdrawal agreement on Ireland, on the budget, and on citizens' rights? Do we then have to reinvent those? Is Mr. Farage correct that we don't have to pay a penny in those circumstances? What is the government's assessment of where we would stand and whether we could somehow revive some of those agreements in what was otherwise a no-deal situation? Yeah. And a no-transition period as a result.
Well, I mean, I think you raise, again, a number of quite substantive issues within that. So perhaps just to unpick those. I mean, firstly, to what extent, if there was no deal, might you be able to have what sometimes gets called managed no deal or mini deals on the side? The position the Commission to date has set out is that they will not entertain that. It is a question of political judgment as to whether you think closer to the time there would be pressure from member states in regard to that. So, for example, Alberto Costa, one of my parliamentary colleagues, has tabled an amendment that passed and was passed by cross-party support in the House of Commons, saying in the event of no deal, then the Parliament would seek a side deal in respect to citizens' rights. Now, there has been support within Europe, support in the European Parliament, support in the Dutch Parliament to do that. That is at odds with the position that the Commission has set out. So there is a debate there. We've had debates on that, and the proof of the pudding in that would be close to the time. The Commission position has been set out. Colleagues such as Alberto says, notwithstanding that, this is in both sides' interests, therefore could you do a mini deal? I think there's a separate debate, and when I talked on this in terms of the financial settlement and what would be the circumstances in a no deal around that. And in a way that points to sometimes the oversimplification of the debate that we often get. So I get some colleagues in the House of Commons saying we won't pay a penny. Now, the reality, and Baroness Kennedy will know this from a sort of legal obligation point of view, but if something we collected as a member, such as customs duties, we have collected on one premise, there would be a legal obligation to pay that. I mean, and I don't think many international lawyers, I think regardless of where they stand on the political debate, would demur from that. You could then have an incremental scale where you could say on the RAL, what commitments were there post-notification, and have a debate on that, again, before my time in office. But those were the sort of arguments I would have expected the negotiating teams to have explored. In the event of there being a no-deal outcome, to what extent would they be revisited? Well, again, that would depend on various factors. But the wider point I'm making on financial settlement is when people say you wouldn't pay a penny, I think pretty much any lawyer, international lawyer, will look at that and say the idea you won't pay 0 penny on a duty you collected as a member of state, I don't think would stand the test of the courts. There's a separate question, which is, would you pay the full 39 billion, or if you paid that, would you pay it over the same time scale, whatever. Those are more detailed, and we could have a whole session on that with the Attorney General and explore that in more detail. But the political debate that you don't pay a penny, I don't think sort of cuts the mustard. In terms of more generally on no deal, then, as you say, we don't comment on leaked stories. I think the wider point I would say is, firstly, I think there's an underappreciation that no deal can still happen. So there's a question as to the 31st of October, if the House has not passed the withdrawal agreement bill, Then there are growing voices in Europe, not least the French, who want to move on to other issues. So there is no automatic right of an extension, and in that scenario it would then be a question for the House as to whether it revoked or opted for a no deal. None of us can sit here and definitively answer that question, because one can't prejudge that outcome. And so the point is, can you categorically say no deal wouldn't happen? Absolutely not. You then get into a subjective debate as to how likely you think it is, or to what extent you will want to shape that debate if you see that coming. And I think there's a separate issue as to the timing of that. When would you want to have that debate? Because there would need to be, you can wait till the Council on the 17th and then suddenly prepare for no deal. So what is it responsible for a government to do, and at what time? So you open it up into various issues. I mean, I've been clear, and I appreciate this wouldn't be the consensus of this committee, but in a choice between no deal and revoke, I feel, and I've repeatedly said this, that the issues are so fundamental to our democracy that my personal position would be to look to mitigate no deal. But I have equally set out to colleagues that there are significant downsides in both scenarios, and I think what's important is that we recognise that, and there will be strong views on that issue around the table. But the point is, if a deal is not passed, then we are heading to that decision, and I have been trying to get colleagues to open their eyes to that inevitability.
Is there such a thing as a managed no deal, in the sense of a jointly managed no deal? I mean, clearly both sides can make contingencies, but some of those may be reciprocated. But does managed new deal a real concept?
Well, so the Alberto Costa amendment, supported by both by party, cross-party, was on the basis of agreeing protections on citizens' rights in exactly that way. So the fact that members of Parliament from all parties supported that suggests that they would hope to reach some agreements to mitigate some of the impacts of no deal in that scenario. Now, whether then member states or the Commission would agree to that, or the Commission on behalf, it is a point that would have to be established in due course. I think the wider point is a responsible government has to mitigate the impact of no deal. That has a significant lead time. But what I think, Lord, is my sense is within the question is there's a distinction between what is within the government's control, what is in the control of third parties such as businesses, and what is in the control of the Commission or member states. And those are different issues. We saw, for example, at Calais, significant steps being taken by the French government in terms of infrastructure there. And then there's a separate issue, I think, with no deal that sometimes gets missed, which is, to what extent should we be using the opportunity of having almost done a drains up and looked at certain areas to question whether we can strengthen our resilience in any regard. So is it the right thing that so much of our supply of goods comes through the short straits in the way that it does? And do we want to diversify that or not? And what is the resilience in certain areas? So I think there are areas alongside no deal where we can actually look more from a general resilience point of view as to what it is good for the government to be doing in any event. John?
A comment first. When Lord Canula and I were in Brussels before Easter, Barnier made it clear to all of the parliaments that whatever the issues addressed in the withdrawal agreement would have to continue to be addressed, even through a no deal. So, they know you can't just leave these things up in the air. But in the...
well, you would say that, though, wouldn't you?
What I want to ask you is, in the given that you still would prefer no deal to revoke, has the government considered the impact of no deal on those people in Northern Ireland, unionists who are not in the DUP, if you like, who are saying they would rather have a united Ireland than go forward with a no deal? Has the government considered the impact of no deal on the future of the Union?
Hugely. And I would say, in terms of shaping the Prime Minister's thinking around the fact that 2 extensions were agreed, that has played extremely heavily with the Prime Minister. I think she has a very strong personal conviction around the importance of the Union. She travelled and gave a speech in Northern Ireland, you will recall, and I think anyone that spoke to her around that time will know that she was also quite moved by the conversations she had within the community, and I think she takes that extremely seriously. And I don't think actually cross-party anyone would think that she doesn't. It would be my view, but perhaps certainly that's not the sense I've ever had. I think the issue is not just the impact on the Northern Ireland. I think there is also a significant impact in terms of Scotland.
Yep.
But I think that impact also cuts to both sides of that debate. So I think there is an impact around no deal and any disruption that flows from that, but there is also an impact in terms of revocation and the impact on that on the debate in Scotland. So again, it's not a one-sided issue. I think actually it impacts on both sides, which comes back to the point is there were only 5 Labour MPs that voted for the deal last time, and people can't have it both ways. They can't consistently vote against the withdrawal agreement, say that that's the only thing that the European Union is willing to now agree, say that they're against that, then say they're against no deal, then say actually they recognise there's also impacts on the Union in terms of revocation. I mean, and these are issues that the other parties also need to engage on.
Secretary, I think we all round the table know that there's a sort of choreography in all of this, in that at this moment there are attempts being made by the opposition to persuade the government of a way in which they might contribute to an idea for going forward. The withdrawal agreement that Mrs May has been putting on the table has repeatedly failed. Alternatives which are put up by other members of the Commons don't seem to have much traction either. And it's becoming more and more clear to many people in the country that it's really stark, that it is looking increasingly like revoke or no deal. And so a point is going to have to come where, in order to take this forward in the choreography, and it may be that you're not at this moment prepared to put the arrangements on the table, some point has to come where it's decided that any of these alternative routes are not going to work, and it really does become about that stark position of either sticking or twisting, that we remain in the European Union or we leave in the way that the hardliners want to leave without any kind of real negotiated relationship. And at what point do you decide whether that is something that you think the House is going to be capable of making a decision on, or do you decide that actually the only way to resolve something as stark as that is to go back to the people? And you see, that's the thing that is increasingly becoming the question that the public are asking. And at what point, because you have to have time to do it, and if our partners in this venture in Europe are saying the deadline is this time, is definitely the 31st of October, we can't have this business of trickling towards the cliff edge. What we need to do is decide pretty soon whether there is going to be an opportunity for the public to have a say on that stark division.
Yep.
And when do you decide that? What is the optimum date for that?
Well, I think firstly I would take issue in terms of the way you frame it, because for me, going back on the biggest vote in our history, that is a hardline position from those that want to go back on that vote. And I find the whole language around a confirmatory vote, which is premised on the basis that people allegedly didn't know what type of leave they were voting for, but the confirmatory vote isn't a choice of different leave options. The confirmatory vote is to go back to a Remain option. And I think I think people that want to argue a second referendum want to revoke, and I think they should say that's their position. And actually having a 12-month delay for a second referendum with all the disruption to business and others that come from that If their position is they want a second referendum in order to remain, then it's much more honest if they actually just said they want to revoke and actually be clear about that. And I think the whole debate around a second referendum is a deflection from people that want to revoke and are not prepared to say they want to revoke.
In your presentation, as you've just given it to us, what you haven't reckoned on is that in the 3 years that we've been sitting around this table, all of us have learned, but so has the general public. The general public isn't stupid. Many people have listened to these debates and have actually started to form a different view about many of the aspects of this that they hadn't considered before. They hadn't realised the extent to which we were putting the Union at risk, the effect on Ireland, the relationship we have with Scotland, the possibilities that in fact will have devastating effects on the jobs of the next generation. So suddenly people are actually getting to grips with the real fundamentals of this. And so why do you feel that there hasn't been sufficient growth of knowledge that the public should have their say on that eventual thing? I'm talking about the point at which other options are not any longer clear.
Yeah, well, I think we're into more sort of mainstream political debate than it, but I mean, you know, depends how much longer I've got to go with this Tesla, Jay. But so I'm pleased, Barnier Kennedy, that you say the public aren't stupid. Because many of us on the Brexiteer side have had the last 3 years with people on the Remain side telling us that we were stupid or didn't understand what we were voting for. And my constituents did understand what they were voting for, and they still understand what it was, and they want this Parliament to deliver on it. And I'll come back to the point that you ask about timing. Well, we're seeking to do a deal. We're seeking the deal ratified, and the timing is shaped by that. But people that want a second referendum should say they want to revoke, because I've yet to find someone who wants a second referendum in order to leave. It's all the people on the side that didn't want to leave who want a second referendum, and all that is doing is prolonging the division, prolonging the uncertainty, and I think people should just be honest about the fact that if they want a second referendum, it's because they want to revoke, and that is the reality of it. And on this, I'm afraid we will agree to disagree, because actually what the business community, what the country needs is to move forward. We had a vote, we had a clear result, and Parliament needs to deliver on it.
But at a moment in time when many of these things have not been part of the public discussion, that's the point. And so why would you be afraid of asking the people, is this still what you want?
But if you want a confirmatory vote, you can have a confirmatory vote between different options of leave. You can have a confirmatory between the Prime Minister's deal and no deal, if that's what you're saying people didn't understand. But I think we're away from the department, we're into a more chamber debate. But the fundamental point is that we had a result, that both parties were elected on manifestos saying they respected that result, and I think the task for Parliament is to deliver on that.
Is it? Secretary of State, what is the government's latest thinking around the structure of the negotiations for the future relationships?
So I think this was an area that Susanna and Alex explored with the committee in terms of the work, because a lot of work has been going on that. And I think part of the challenge on that from a sort of Whitehall architecture perspective is when we are going to get into that phase and how we do that. In terms of the structure, I think the first thing is for us to recognise that we will need to gear the architecture of Whitehall quite differently. So the leadership of that will come through my department. So the Department for Exit and European Union will lead on that. We need to look at how we bring in the various sort of sector issues, how we bring in the devolved administrations in a meaningful way. Different sectors, different industrial issues will impact differently depending on the territories. So a lot of work has been going on that phase 2, but the key challenge at the moment is how we actually get to it.
So if a lot of work's been going on about the thinking around this, how much can you tell us about the shape or the pattern, the model that is emerging in that thinking?
Well, I think the main will be in terms of the role of UCREP, which one of the things we've been doing to prepare for phase 2 is expanding UCREP and the presence in Brussels. We'll need to look at the role in terms of currently we've had the Cabinet Office Europe unit working through number 10, whereas in the phase 2 that will come through DEXU in terms of the architecture within government. Again, part of it will be how we segment it with the different sectors and the different administrations.
So you're anticipating that there'll be separate negotiating streams, as it were, and am I right, DEXU will be the coordinator of those separate negotiating strands?
Yes. So there'll be, our estimate is there'll be 12 to 15 different work streams, and the role of the department will be to act as the coordinator of those.
And you mentioned the need to bring in the devolved administrations or to engage with them. How substantial do you think their role will be? How much do you think they will think they have a significant role in the negotiating process?
Well, I think that will vary depending on the different work streams and what the interests are there. But I think one of the key issues, and this is why I'm very keen on the official-to-official level engagement, which is there will be a huge amount of data and expertise that are within the devolved administrations that are relevant to certain work streams to reflect the economic interests that apply. And I think one of the lessons that comes out of the first phase is how we work closely with them in order that we give them as much notice of issues as possible.
And finally, how will the UK's negotiating mandate be set? And how will parliamentary approval for that mandate be achieved?
Well, that is something, it's a very important point. That is something we have been discussing through the talks with the official opposition. I think the key issues there is what is the reporting structure back into Parliament? What is the frequency of that? How do we get much earlier agreement into what are the trade-offs? Because I think one of the key issues will be not just the work in each individual work stream, but how one trades, what are the trade-offs between the different priorities. And I think there's a role, one of the things I think I mentioned at our last session is I see much more of a role for the select committees as part of that process. I had 4 years on the Public Accounts Committee, and what I always felt was that a select committee's report was only effective if it was agreed, and therefore the way the select committee operated was very different to the way members of Parliament engaged in the chamber. And I think there's a lot of ability to work with the select committees in a different way, both in terms of the personal relationships on the select committee, the commonality of interest. People get to know each other over time, and I think the select committees operate in a different way, and I think there's a lot we can do in terms of then looking both at the work streams working with particular select committees, but also then when we come to look at some of the trade-offs, how we have representation between the select committees looking at that.
But do you anticipate parliamentary approval for the mandate being sought before the negotiations start?
Well, as I say, I don't want to go too much into the detail of where we are on the discussions, but I think it is it goes back to the point on number. There is a political reality that I think many members of Parliament feel that the withdrawal agreement was presented to Parliament without them being as engaged on it as early, and I expect Parliament, regardless of what government wants to do, Parliament will be looking to have a more active role in the negotiations than perhaps it did in the first phase. So I think that is a reality anyway. Clearly, from a government point of view, we need to protect both from a constitutional point of view, but also our ability to be nimble, to respond to issues, to work at pace. There are legitimate concerns. There's issues in terms of what can be shared in confidence and how secure that is. There's certain committees in the House. The Intelligence Security Committee has always had a very strong record, but then the subject matter lends itself to that. There's other committees where that may be more difficult. So those are the issues we're discussing.
Well,
Could I ask you a bit about the preparations for influencing in Brussels once we are no longer a member? One mighty band we can get into that post-Brexit world. The EU agencies, let's start with them. We're going to need new ways, practical ways of interacting, relating and influencing them. They're acceptable not only to us but also, of course, to them and the other members. What preparations are in train, and can you give us some colour around how you see that actually working in a post-Brexit world?
You're absolutely right. And I think the first thing is that we confront that head on, accept the relationship will be different. So the relationship with different will be, I think that'll be clear at Prime Minister level, because just the rhythm of council meetings and things that were part of us as a member as opposed to being a third party is different. I think that's reflected in things I mentioned, the resourcing of UCREP and how we're looking at that. It's mentioned in terms of, for example, me going to Romania last week. And I think sometimes people sort of question, well, that was a debate about the future of Europe. Why is the UK going? And for me, if I pick out one statistic, 18 million Africans coming into the labour market a year, but jobs for fewer than 4 million. Now, that is not a Europe-centric issue, but you can't debate the flow of migration, you can't debate the issues around security and terrorism, you can't debate the economic potential of industries such as fintech without thinking through what are the implications around those sort of numbers. It's my contention that the UK has a key role to play there through links, through our soft power, through our DFID aid budget, through various issues that we have through our security present.
But sorry, can I press a little bit more? I'm a practical soul. I think those sort of informal contacts and so forth that you've referred to are all very well, but are there ways we can actually be in those agencies influencing them directly? Is there any preparation to try
So firstly, the political declaration in many of those areas keeps open the option. And I think this was one of the points that sort of flowed from the earlier conversations around the Labour talks. So to the extent that political declaration doesn't give commitments on some agencies, is that because the UK government didn't want it? Or is it that because of the way that phase of the talks came at the end and what people were in a position to do, and it's much more the latter. So I think one of the issues in the political declaration enables us to have further discussion as part of the run-up to December 2020 on that. Do we see merit in engagement in many of those agencies? Yes, we do. And that is something that we will explore as part of the next phase of the discussions.
As you've repeatedly said, it's a two-way process. Whether they all welcome our involvement is another matter, and let's leave that rhetorical for the moment. My second and final question is, you mentioned UCREP. Clearly they're going to have an important role, but there's also all our missions in all the member states. Are they being prepared? Are they being resourced to take on those roles in the individual states where they are?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a sort of list of each of our sort of where we are, but absolutely, I mean, ultimately that'll be part of the spending review discussion. But I think the point that underpins it is we absolutely recognise we'll need to operate differently, and that we'll need to engage more time, which, as I say, at ministerial level, but also in terms of resource and expertise. I think in terms of your point about it being a two-way, and whether they would welcome our engagement. I think a good illustration is things such as the European arrest warrant. I mean, we surrender 8 times more so numerically than the EU surrenders to the UK. So just as a point of logic, there is a clear benefit to the EU. Now, if that 8 times is split between the 27, so if you look at it on a bilateral basis, it's slightly different. But the point is, there is a mutual interest there. There is no politician, as far as I'm aware, within the EU 27, when it comes to issues such as terrorism, that doesn't want to be working with the UK and its expertise to address that. So there's a question of what could be done at that time, and there is a question is what are the opportunities moving forward. But there are clear areas such as that of mutual interest, and the question then will be how can we do that in a way that reflects some of the sort of more detailed issues. So what then is the role of the ECJ in those sort of issues? So you get into some of the detail, but actually there are areas of common interest.
I'm just looking for an assurance that we are going to be tooled up in our missions to take on this?
Hugely. No, very much so. And I think, in a way, again, almost sort of look at what we're doing, I suppose, what we're saying, and the fact that I travelled to Cebu last week hopefully gives you an indication of the appetite and the recognition that this is something we need to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. And final question from Baroness Sutton.
You're relieved that it's the last group of questions. If I just briefly on the governance of the withdrawal agreement, could you say a little bit more about how you see the Joint Committee and the specialised committees working in practice?
Well, again, I think there's quite a bit in the text around the respective roles. With the specialised committees will consider the issues covered by the areas where, but they can't make the formal decisions, and then you'll have the ministerial oversight, which is where the more formal decisions, they must be made by mutual consent, which I think again is an important protection there. And obviously in terms of the regularity of engagement, that will be one of the issues as well that we need to look at, but in terms of what can be done through them. And
in terms of reporting back to this committee, would you make the commitment that you or the relevant appropriate minister would report back either before or ideally before and after meetings of the Joint Committee? I think there's difficult. I think this came up last time. I think there's difficulty in what can be done before in terms of sort of closing off optionalities. But I think in terms of post-joint committees, to some extent, I'm not sure it will be my discretion, because I think the committee will no doubt be seeking for me to return regardless of what I said in answer to that question. So I recognise that there will clearly be interest in the outcomes of those, and there will be a need to engage with your committee, and I'm sure in the other place with the committees there. And in terms of transparency of the meeting documents, the schedules, the agendas, etc., would you expect them to be deposited in Parliament for scrutiny? I think some of that detail will still need to be ruled out, but again, I just look to the reality where the House is. We had a humble address requiring legal advice to be disclosed. I don't think actually that was a good decision in the House of Commons, but if you put that as one extent of the range, the question then for ministers is what is it we can agree up front with the committees that is a reasonable expectation in terms of documentation. And actually what I would be hoping perhaps through the clerk of the committee is to try and get to an area of understanding as to what the committee would like to see, when they'd like to see it. And I think there's enough people around the committee that have been in government and understand where government needs flexibility and where Parliament has a legitimate interest. And finally, what would be your response to the recommendation from this committee for a new mechanism whereby either House could require a response from the government if there were concerns about EU legislative proposals that would have a particularly adverse effect on this country? Well, I mean, ultimately, ministers can't constrain the House. If the House wants certain things, then there are ways that the House will assert itself and request those. I think in terms of, more. Sorry, just say again, what was the... Well, the proposal from those committees is that if either House, there would be a new mechanism whereby either House could require the government to raise concerns about specific EU legislative proposals. The pipeline, yeah. So, well, I mean, I think one of the reasons goes back to Baron's performance question. One of the reasons why one doesn't want to extend is there is a sort of natural life cycle in terms of how long it takes for EU rules to come through. Normally, it's very difficult. There is a time in terms of the time pattern of that, which provides protection. That's partly why the transition period is the length it is, partly linked to the financial end date, but also partly because usually anything less than 2 years is quite difficult for the rules cycle to come through. There is also, I mean, it's worth remembering that there is also a requirement in terms of good faith in the documentation that rules can't be brought through that are sort of targeted at the UK
in a particular way. So there are within the withdrawal agreement protection. There is protection in that regard, but also at the same time, and this is points that Bill Cash has raised, the committee already has sight in terms of the documentation coming through, and there will be a desire, I'm sure, to continue to have that sight moving forward.
A very, very quick question for Lord Davison.
Yes, the question we all get asked the Secretary of State is, what the heck's going to happen at the end of the day? Can you give us an answer for that?
We're going to leave. So I think at the end of the day, I think we will leave because there was a clear result, and I think it is the job of Parliament to deliver on the result. And I think it's not just the damage that will be caused to democracy in this country. I think one of the strengths of the United Kingdom is around the world. We often see democratic decisions taken and then not respected by governments. And I think historically we have been seen, and part of the soft power of the United Kingdom, as a beacon of democracy and a country that respects democracy. And I think it's beholden on all members of Parliament and members of your House to, I think, respect the democratic result.
Thank you.
Well, I think those last two questions have shown how important it has, how much we appreciate the evidence you've given to us, and thank you very much for that, but also how much we'll enjoy seeing you in future as this rather convoluted process continues along its way. But thank you very much indeed for coming and giving this to us today. We're very grateful to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceedings